Oops.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
So hello everyone. My theme tonight is breaking through the limits of lean and agile frameworks, and I assume most of you have a busy day. I thought, well, instead of immediately beginning with my talk, I would like to invite everyone to fill in a poll, and I would like to invite you to go to Mentimeter. If you have a smartphone, you can go to www.menti.com. Then you come on a screen where you need to enter a code, and then you will come into the tool or the questions that the question that I would like to start with tonight. And that's the question: what problems have you already experienced in facilitating agile and lean initiatives? And you will get a number of possibilities. You're enabled to choose two of them, namely poor compatibility of tools with operations and support. Scrum Masters end up acting like project managers, correctly estimating how long it takes to complete a single task, accumulated buildup of unresolved issues over the project lifetime, sprints ending up churning out an endless stream of new features without any iteration on what has previously been released, teams that may be over-focused on rushing to get work done without thinking about the value of the quality of that work. If you have experienced other problems, please tick the other box. If you have not experienced any of those issues, you can also make that known. So I hope everyone is familiar with menti.com. I will go to the screen where we can see eventually the results of the Mentimeter. So you should see it on my screen, and I will wait for another minute. For people to complete the questionnaire. So if people have not yet completed it, please do so. The more people join, the better the outcome. So what we see is that the first two items, Scrum Masters acting up as project managers and correctly estimating the time to complete tasks, is most frequently experienced, followed by the accumulation of the accumulated buildup of unresolved issues over the project lifetime, and sprints end up churning out an endless stream of new features. Can I ask the two participants who filled in other, what other issues that they experience with agile and lean initiatives?
Yeah, it's Birgit speaking. One.
Can you put on your mic?
Yeah. Sorry, I did it once. It didn't work. Sorry. Yeah, one experience was that teams got overloaded. Although, I mean, their story points were probably correctly estimated, but there were unpredictable incidences occurring, and due to that issue, there was not really time left for topics like innovation. I mean, there should be some free time to do something.
Okay. I will put that in the group and I will come back to that one. Was there somebody else who also ticked the other box?
Yeah, that was me. So I picked it because I see that one of the issues that I saw was the poor communication, because people are not in the habit of talking to each other.
Okay. Poor communication, and I assume giving and receiving feedback also.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. We'll come back to those issues in just a minute. Let me go back to my presentation. I will be talking today about 3 forgotten dimensions in the organization of work. 3 forgotten dimensions in the agile and lean setup. And the first one is designing work as a whole of relationships between functions. The second one is supporting employees in their growth towards the richer interpretation of their working reality. And the third one is mobilizing upstream diversity in thinking spaces for more integrated decision-making through critical facilitation. So my presentation today is structured around those 3 issues, and I hope by the end of the session, in about an hour, I will have given you an idea of those 3 forgotten dimensions and what you can do to improve the agile and lean approaches that you are combining in your projects or in your organization. So let me start by the first, let me start by the overview of the 3 forgotten dimensions. And that's an organizational dimension, which I have given a light green color. And that's essentially the question, what essential difference a role holder must make. So if we talk about a Scrum Master, a product owner, a product manager, a solution manager, a solution architect, what essential difference do those role holders make? What are they expected to create? And of course, what are they doing? The second question, or the second forgotten dimension, is about how employees make an interpretation of their job. We falsely make the assumption that individuals execute their role. What I will be trying to convey today is that very few people execute their role. They create their role, and in creating their role, they make interpretations. And those interpretations are in line with where they are in their developmental process. That's the second dimension. If you do not take into account that developmental process, all the issues that you have just read and chosen will pop up. And there is a third dimension that we are missing, and that is the danger of downward dynamics in cooperation. Downward dynamics in cooperation mean that the teams you're working with narrow the scope of projects and run out of time, budget, because the kind of decision making that they are engaging for is well, too narrow. It's not rich enough. And that means that they will not be able to grasp the whole context, that they will not see emerging changes and consequences that they will miss certain evolutions, that they miss structural relationships in their approach of their projects, and that they also miss the transformational potential that is often linked to the projects they are engaging with. What those three angles have in common is that I would like to invite you to see work as a mind-meeting interplay. We are used to look at work and work execution from a competency and skills lens. And the whole agile movement over-focuses, in my opinion, on competencies, skills, procedures, work processes, all kinds of formats that have the intention to direct the behavior of people. And what we want is people that are more flexible in a certain sense, but by focusing on creating that behavior, we are basically hindering that behavior if we do not create a balance between the doing dimension and the thinking dimension in Agile. So my basic argument tonight will be inviting you to develop a kind of reflective practice. Let me go into the first dimension. And the first dimension is about designing work as a whole of relationship between functions. I've been doing quite some work in finding out what characterizes sustainable growth companies and teams working in sustainable growth companies. And I saw that basically, if you compare sustainable growth companies with low growth companies, they follow a kind of architecture, a kind of design of work in which they see work and value creation happening in different organizational dialogue spaces, which I call we spaces. And the stories people tell in the different we spaces is quite different from one another. What you see are structures popping up, making a difference between a quality and service delivery we space, a continuous improvement we space, a value stream we space, and a business modeling we space. This table summarizes the main themes in each of the we spaces, and the themes are, let's say, the subjects that drive the dialogue in each of the we spaces. In the quality of and service delivery we space, the theme is immediate fulfillment of client expectations and client requirements. The attention is in the here and now. And the dialogue is very much focused on the activities to be done or to be improved. Often there is an over-focus on individual behavior, and quality and quantity indicators often guide the dialogue and the discussion. While in the continuous improvement we space, the focus is on optimization and differentiation of sub-processes. So in the continuous improvement space, you have a thinking about coherent activities, forming a kind of a whole, and that whole we label as sub-processes. And sub-processes are often require the collaboration of individuals in teams. The key lens, the type of indicators that are chosen or that work best in the continuous improvement space are efficiency and effectiveness, measures. There are measures of current processes and procedures. And often the focus in the continuous improvement V-space is a focus on the project scoping, the funneling, the sequencing of different projects. In the value stream V-space, the focus is on the profit model. The perspective is not the perspective of today's or this week's or this month's work, but it provides a perspective of 6 months to 2 years. And it focuses on transversal processes. One could say that the operational model forms the context for the sub-processes, while the sub-processes form the context for the activities. And the transversal processes, in their turn, are embedded in ecosystemic processes, which are key in the business model V-space. So each V-space has a specific combination of themes that guide the dialogue within that V-space. In the value stream V-space, the dialogue is mainly focused on interdependencies. The roadmap is often a tool used there, while in the business modeling V-space, the tools are more portfolio tools, investment assessments, and thinking about sensitive intervention points. Now, why am I sharing this? For the simple reason that in the different V-spaces, you have different roles. For example, in the business modeling V-space, you can have the epic owners and the enterprise architects. In the value stream V-space, you have quite a potential number of roles: solution managers, business owners, product managers, solution architects, systems architects. You might have a problem if those business owners, product managers do not execute or take up the dialogue in the complementing value stream space, but for example, in the continuous improvement space, where you have product owners, scrum masters, and in the quality and service delivery space, project members or sprints that are done. The time horizon of sprints, the 1, 2, or 3 week time horizon that you have them, push people in a lens of quality and service delivery. But if the role sequence is not designed well, you might get overlaps and gaps. And what do I mean with overlaps and gaps? If there are too many levels of management, for example, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the product manager all focus on continuous improvement, you might have an overlap, and that automatically leads to diffuse accountabilities and responsibilities. Because what happens is that at least one of them becomes an extra communication link, slowing down decisions as they want to create value towards one another. And what has been designed as an agile system becomes basically, if roles are all designed in a continuous improvement, or even worse, in a quality and service delivery space, you get a system that slows down decision making and that counteracts the creation of an agile and lean environment. This kind of role design is also responsible for, let's say, taking distance of the initial enthusiasm by which the initial tools, processes, and approaches are embraced. The issue with too few levels of management, for example, if there is a gap between Scrum Master and the product owner, that means that the lens of the product owner is on rethinking value streams, while the Scrum Masters focus on the, let's say, facilitating the quality and service delivery dialogue. You will have a miscommunication between C and B, because there is a kind of a translator that is missing here. The Scrum Master in this situation will experience the product owner as somebody who is insufficiently in touch with what needs to be done with the issues at hand. While in overlap, the different roles try to gain a territory within the same dialogue space, and they do not reinforce each other, but they start to hinder each other. So if roles are poorly designed within agile or lean working, and when do they get poorly designed? They get poorly designed when they get combined with other roles. For example, if I'm a line manager and I'm also assuming a product owner role, but my line management role is in the value streams domain, well, I will color that role in a different way. When I'm an enterprise architect and I'm focusing on continuous improvement, but not on seeing through the structure of relationships following from the business modeling, I will never be able to, let's say, design the conditions for the other colleagues to deliver great work. So this is the first dimension, the dimension of what happens when we forget that an organized setup is a setup where you think through the relationship between functions. I've been involved in several agile and lean setups where the initial roles that you see traditional in agile and lean projects like Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Product Manager are designed either all within the quality and service delivery domain or all within the continuous improvement domain. And that's a setup for failure if you do not reconceive those roles. So you need to rethink role relationships in whatever agile project you start. And even worse, if the agile project is within the value stream domain, those key roles need basically to be designed within the value stream domain. If they are designed within the continuous improvement domain, they will not produce the added value that you might expect, and the rethinking of value streams will not happen, at least not as you have planned for it. The second forgotten dimension is the dimension of interpretation of one's work reality. Suppose we have, let's say, well designed the roles. People start telling the story as you have made it up, as you have prepared. That's what I call the external workplace. Almost 95% of the attention in Agile and Lean projects go to the external workplace. But people also have an internal workplace. They have a frame of reference, and that's by nature hidden. And in that internal workplace, there are two dimensions that came out of research on how adults develop throughout their lifetime. And the first finding is that people are subject to following a number of scripts. They follow kind of a scenario that determines how they engage in projects, how they assume accountability, how they communicate, how they engage in creative work, and so on. You can compare a script with what happens in reality TV programs. Most individuals participating in those kinds of programs take decisions not because they do that very consciously, but they are brought in situations by the scenarists of the TV show. And so they are subject to the script that they follow. The second dimension is that people use cognitive maps to explore what they need to be doing. Kanban, for example, is a kind of a map. Using Visch diagrams is a kind of a map that you're using. The domain of Agile and Lean working is dominated by the use of logical, analytical, expert maps. One of the maps that we are all familiar with is a map of categorizing problems and assuming that if we solve each problem individually, each fragmented problem individually, that we will have solved the issue. Well, most of you who have already facilitated quite some projects and paid attention to the interrelationships of those programs already experienced when you have solved individual fragmented problems that you rarely have solved the whole issue. So sprints as such are a mechanism to fragment issues, and it builds the illusion, in my opinion, that you will make progress in a fast way. Let me detail this a bit further. And what I would like to invite you is that the external workplace is basically the first job that we have. That's kind of delivering a contribution. But how you look, the kind of development of your own frame of reference is the second job that you have, or that members working in Agile and Lean projects have, and that will determine how you will cope with the limits and the challenges and the unpredictable things in Agile and Lean working. So maps are frame of references, and they are only useful if it shows something that we have not seen before. It selects, it takes certain things out of reality, and it leaves others out. So the London Underground, I love that, to take that as an example. The distances and the proportions that you see on the map of the London Underground are not right. I have some clients that have their offices around St. Paul's, which is on the red line, just almost vertical under King's Cross St. Pancras. For those familiar with London, it takes about 20 to 25 minutes by tube from St. Pancras to St. Paul's. But it only takes about 10 minutes to Euston Square by underground. Now, if you walk from King's Cross to St. Paul's, it will take you about 15 minutes. But if you walk from King's Cross to Euston, it will take you about 20 to 25 minutes. So if you start thinking about maps, they only determine what we think is important, and they never reflect reality. If you start to use maps, you will at a certain moment be confronted by the fact that they get outdated. It's a bit like not using the most adequate maps. I was on I hired a boat during my last holiday, and so I have a navigational map. But if I would use that navigational map to find a Romanesque church in a certain city, I would never find that Romanesque church with the navigational map or with the geological map. So in Agile, in Lean projects, we will always be confronted with the necessity to rethink our maps. And I will come back to that in just a moment. Our frame of references, or how I make an interpretation of reality, that is basically evolving throughout adulthood. And there are two dimensions which are essential here. The first one is about the implicit answer that you give in what should I do and for whom. And we develop in phases where we put ourselves first and then what we do together first. The first phase in our professional life is what I call an ego phase, where we put our own needs central, where we use frameworks, tools, and maps in a very instrumental way to control the situation. The basic idea when functioning from the ego phase is that we can predict reality. We can have a grip on how a certain specific project will unfold. That's basically an instrumental way of approaching reality. But of course, the more we use tools that incorporate the kind of best practice, the longer we can stay in that illusion of control. But at a certain moment, we will internalize those frameworks, and we start acting from the we phase, searching for recognition, searching for consensus, depending on each other. The we phase is a phase where people have difficulties in providing adequate feedback to one another. They also keep on functioning from an expert logic, because that expert logic, for example, I'm an expert in a client experience department, I will keep on acting from my role in that client experience department, because that's what is essential in how I make an interpretation of my responsibilities. And some experience the limits of other dependent working and proceed to a perspective phase which is more a self-managing space, where you function from limits and where you're able to integrate perspectives of others in your own perspective. The self-managing promise linked to many agile ways of working is very difficult to reach with people operating from an ego or from a we face script like. You can only succeed in creating a self-organizing structure when the majority of participants operates from the perspective or the effective, the self-authoring or the self-aware developmental phase. In maps I call that the fluidity of thinking. This is the dimension that informs us on how do I approach reality, how do I engage in problems, how do I take perspective. And there we evolve from an expert way of thinking to a complex analytical thinking, which is a thinking where experts start taking into account much more context than they're used to do. Then it moves towards process thinking, systemic thinking, and transformational thinking. I will not go into the details of the thinking thoughts, the thought structures behind each of those ways of approaching a reality. I will do that in my second talk in February next year. But what I want to convey today is that when you have project teams staffed with people operating from an ego phase or from a major expert thinking phase without paying sufficient attention to the development of, let's say, the inner dialogue, that you will bump into problems. You will meet all the issues that you have just reflected upon while completing the Mentimeter in the beginning of this session. So if you have continuous improvement initiatives, continuous improvement require minimally complex analytical thinking and process thinking, and minimally require people challenging one another, questioning one another from the perspective phase. It requires mainly the integration of different perspectives. If that doesn't happen and mainly expert thinkers participate in projects, they will narrow their approach to complexity, which might be reflected in an over focus on rushing to get work done without thinking about the value or the quality of that work. That basically means that they do not take into account sufficient context or sufficient emerging change in what they are doing. And they might invest their energy in things that are becoming irrelevant, but they are not yet seeing how their work reality is evolving. They might also end up churning out endless streams of new features without any iteration on what has previously been released. So they do not make an assessment of how what I'm making progress on is linked to the broader context and to the overarching processes that are almost in every situation that I have seen, are evolving. So employees operating from a narrower approach to complexity, they fall into the trap of seeing their plans and their projects from a too static lens on reality, while employees operating from a broader approach to reality, by which I mean that they take into account sufficient context, they are aware of emerging changes, they see structural relationships, and they have a sense for the transformational potential and how to handle unexpected tension. Those employees will take a longer perspective on things. They will go beyond the limits of their own role. They will usually adapt the tools and the practices to the specifics of the situation, and they will probably act as critical facilitators. But those employees are not the most easy to work with. And they might create a lot of tension within the system if the system is confronted with a kind of downwardly divided dynamic, which I will explain in just a minute. The transition between other dependent and self-authoring is in Agile and Lean projects the most crucial hurdle for most of the people. People acting from another dependence script, they possess their expertise. They derive their identity and sense of validity from being recognized as a member of a group of experts who follow professional rules. And they perceive criticism as an attack on their identity. So if you introduce even best practice tools within a group dominated by other dependent operating colleagues, they might even reject those tools. They will have difficulties to embrace those tools and to start working with them if they are insufficiently linked to their professional identity. It's a dimension often overlooked in the introduction of Agile and Lean ways of working. Self-authoring people, they possess not the expertise, but they know the difference between possessing expertise and being an expert. Being expert means that they acknowledge that there are other expertises that they can integrate with each other. And they experience feedback often as constructive for their own development. And this facilitates collaboration across different disciplines. So you need to pay attention to the development of the inner dialogue. If I bring together the two, and I'm coming to the third dimension that remains hidden in a lot of Lean and Agile projects, that's the nature of the dialogue dynamics. We have seen the different we spaces, the quality and service delivery space, the continuous improvement, and the value stream we space. We know from research that there is a kind of an alignment, a kind of an ideal alignment to operate in the continuous improvement we space. You need a selection of colleagues operating from other dependent and self-authoring scripts, and that embrace complex and process thinking. In the value stream we space, you need systemic thinking. In the quality and service delivery space, you need expert thinking. Now, what happens if the developmental diversity in a team is spread over the instrumental and other dependent ways of approaching reality? You will have teams that will unconsciously narrow assignments or even narrow the toolkit that is provided to them. If you have, let's say, an optimal spread of the development diversity, in that kind of situation, you can expect the team to be able to tackle the full breadth and depth of the challenge at hand. And if the team operates from a script that is higher than what is required, you might need enhanced fluidity of thinking and strengthening of the team's agenda. In most of the literature on Agile, you will get stories of developmental team 2 diversity without that is being made explicit how that happens. Let me take it a step further. And if you have in the structuring of the dialogue in the different dialogue spaces, in each dialogue space, a specific tension. In the continuous improvement space, the attention goes to developing procedures, and the coordination gets a lot of attention. Coordination is the activity of routinization, of stabilizing the means of common action. For example, following the sprint procedures or doing the daily start meetings are forms of coordination. You kind of instruct how things might work in a kind of ideal situation, while the cooperation is about reflecting on when does what we are using here is still valid or needs to be rethought. And cooperation is about thinking through new ways of operating together. So it's a creative activity, and you will always have the tension in the continuous improvement space between that creative activity and the coordination activity. So I have seen a lot of sprints done in kind of very bureaucratic way, in a kind of a coordinative way instead of a cooperative way. In the value stream management space, there is a tension between cooperation and co-construction. Co-construction is about constructing literally the interdependencies of different work streams. Often we use the road mapping as a tool to co-construct, but what I see in practice is that the roadmap becomes a list of projects where each project struggles with the coordination, cooperation tension, but where there is insufficient dialogue on the interdependencies and what forms the context and the conditions for enabling projects to be carried out in a fluid and, let's say, agile way. While in the business modeling space, you have a tension between co-constructing and co-modeling. So if you then look at how roles are conceived, and you may look at, you may make a random selection of role descriptions of product owners, of business owners, of Scrum Masters. Most of the practices that you will need will be practices that address implicitly the tension between coordination and cooperation, and that tension is put on the shoulders of the managers too. The managers also start to act from a coordination or cooperation perspective. And the value streams, the rethinking of value streams, and the reconception of the business modeling space remains out of the attention. I've brought with me here a visual of an agile team working with it, and you can ask the question, what can you expect from the way in which this team discusses the continuous improvement with each other? If you look at where they put their focus on, they act within the quality and service delivery domain, so focusing on fulfillment and not alignment. They act from an other dependency script, and their approach to problems is mainly dominated by expert maps. Well, what you will see in that kind of team is that retrospectives happen, but people will give up on surfacing problems because they never see things change. The other dependent people expect others to change the situation for them. If they would act in a self-authoring, from a self-authoring script, they would take charge themselves of addressing the issues. This is the typical profile of a team that over-focuses on rushing to get the work done without thinking about the value or the quality of that work. They will rely on specialization and handoffs without finding ways to parallelize or cross-pollinate skill sets even within the team. So it brings us to the question, what can you now do to, let's say, prevent downwardly divided, a downwardly divided dynamic happening? And one of the most essential things to do is really to reconceive the role of a Scrum Master, which is basically a facilitator role. It's a person that makes an action or a process more easy or easier, mainly through behavioral interventions. My suggestion is to reconceive that role into a critical facilitator role, which is a role that increases complexity, which questions critically, transcends the perspectives present, keeps the differences and tensions on the table productively for as long as possible, and so thinks through the relationships between how will we evolve over doing different sprints over a period of the whole project, over a period of 6 months to a year, and is mainly focusing on developing the maturity and or fluidity of thinking in that group. The greatest limitation of the critical facilitator is his or her own perspective So the own developmental phase, if as a Scrum Master, you're operating from a instrumental phase, that means that there is a high probability that you will start acting like a kind of a product owner, focusing on control, focusing on, more the temporary outcome, and not seeing the project in its real breadth and depth. As a critical facilitator, you will basically influence the balance between telling and asking. And you can only do that when you start focusing not only on the behavior, but also on the thought structures that people use in addressing issues. If you do not do that, the telling each other what needs to be done starts to dominate the change process. And we know from studying change processes over a longer time that change processes that are dominated by telling are only partially successful and have to deal with a lot of resistance within those change projects. While if there is a focus on asking, you might reach your objectives much faster and much more fluent versus focusing on telling. What I'm basically trying to convey is that, in the current Agile and Lean logic follows a very Tayloristic view on managing people. And that's a view where you treat humans as resources and not as living beings, not as beings developing over the lifetime, developing their sense and meaning making, the scripts from which they operate, the mental maps through which they approach reality. The Tayloristic view is over-focusing the attention on competencies and capabilities for joint problem solving, decision making, and role making, but they're basically hindering the development of those capabilities, and they do not render the individual's potential. While if you start rethinking Agile and Lean from the complexity of the work that creates value, and that you start looking at work from the relationship between roles and functions, so thinking through from in which dialogue space that they need to contribute, that they need to make or create a difference, and that you start looking at the alignment of the value creation with the scripts and fluidity of thinking, so the developmental phase from which people operate, and from there on start observing how the developmental diversity creates upwards or downwardly divided dynamics, then you are ready for what I call a dynamic collaboration, which I summarized in my two latest books, Dynamic Collaboration and Practices of Dynamic Collaboration, which are both available on my website, together with a number of tools like the rethinking game that will enable you to rethink also how you can approach or how you can transcend the limits of Agile and Lean frameworks. So I think we still have some time for dialogue or for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jan.
Are there any questions in the group or things that come to your mind that or reactions that you want to share?
Any question? Okay. Okay, I have just a couple of questions, Jan, that I took in during your presentation. The first one is, let me say, it's a very selfish question. For me, as Agile coach, that I'm working actually with the Scrum Masters. What can be a good tips that I can use, let me say, tomorrow, starting a new journey in my collaboration with the Scrum Master?
Well, the question of tips is often a reflection of operating from an instrumental point of view or script, because tips create the false assumption that you can make the difference with small steps, and there are no small steps here. The only thing that I can advise here is really to start exploring and deepening your inner reflection and dialogue, and start to observe where you are in your own developmental process. And that means that you can reconceive, for example, behavioral programs focusing on giving and receiving feedback, because that's an essential quality and competency that you need. But you can enrich those programs with findings from adult developmental research. That's one thing you can do. The second thing that you can do is really do not take it for granted that people will execute the roles that you're trying to convey in a natural way. They make a reinterpretation of those roles. And in that reinterpretation, you will see how that contributes to narrowing or extending the scope of projects. And it's that narrowing or extension process is a process you need to start giving a place in the retros, in looking back. So what I see is that often the discussions, the retro discussions in Lean and Agile working, or the reflect back workshops, are over-focused on discussing how have we done things here, but they are not focused on discussing what kind of reflection did we engage in that brought us to choosing this approach and this how to do things. So you need to introduce a third dimension besides the content of the discussion and discussion on how did we do things. You need to discuss also how did we reflect upon things and what are the patterns in how we make sense of reality. Do we approach reality from an expert, a complex analytical point of view, a process point of view, a systemic point of view, or a transformational point of view? And you can invite people to start recognizing that. These are some things you can pay attention to.
So rethinking. Any more questions?
It's really not taking the Agile and Lean textbooks for granted, because they only paint 60–65% of the picture, by which I do not say that they do not contain very valuable insights and methodologies, but you need to take into account that by sticking to those best practices, you will not succeed in building winning projects.
Thank you, Jan.
The number of failed agile and lean projects is much higher than the success cases. I think the ratio, if I look to my own clients, is 1 out of 6 success projects. So for 1 successful project, you have 5 failed projects. And that's due to the neglect of those 3 basic hidden dimensions.
Thank you, Jan.
Does that make sense? Do you recognize this?
Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense, I think, because part of the activity in the agile transformation is about mindset shifting that is not exactly happening, let me say, like reading or writing a book. So you cannot really predict how this kind of shifting may happen, when, how, and what is the final result. So I think
but
that
you can make an assessment of the fluidity of thinking present in an individual's mind. You can assess that on a group level, on a team level, and that insight will inform you what type of dialogue will be possible. That will inform you whether or not you can really use the team for rethinking value streams, or just appeal on their expert knowledge to improve certain details.
But how can I assess fluidity mindset in a person or in a team? Is there some tool? Do you?
Well, these are tools that have been developed in adult developmental research. I share them within my books. This would require a whole new lecture just to teach you how to assess maturity of thinking and fluidity of thinking. And I will provide certain courses in spring next year, foundation courses that will allow you to make those assessments. But it requires about 3 hours to really start in depth in explaining how you really can build fluidity of thinking, how you can start shifting the scripts from which one is operating. It's through structured interview and through really probing in detail the thought structures one uses.
Thank you, Jan.
But those who want an introduction, well, I can make reference to my publications. And you can find certain articles on my website.
Great. Any more questions?
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit and say,
Kate, you have to talk louder. We cannot hear you.
Because I've got my speaker over here. Let me try this.
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah,
that's better.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on when you were talking about the roles within kind of the teams and things. Do you think that there's a value to having a mixture of mindsets in a team? I know you mentioned about the different roles and people having different mindsets, but is it important to have a mixture in the team, or would you want everybody to have a kind of a more evolved mindset, I suppose?
You will probably have diversity in fluidity of thinking in your team, and you will have fluidity of thinking you will have different people operating from different scripts in your team. What is important to understand is which subgroup starts to dominate the dialogue in your team. So if the narrower developed sub-team starts to dominate the dialogue, you will have a downwardly divided dynamic. If the more developed team members manage to, let's say, to guide the dialogue, you will probably have an upwardly divided dynamic. The upwardly divided dynamic is basically a dynamic that at certain points will make a reinterpretation of the scope of the project, the necessary budget, and the timelines. The downwardly divided dynamic will probably not deliver on time, within budget, or within scope. So you have, my point of view, my point of departure is that you have probably a diversity. Get to know that diversity, but know what type of diversity works within what kind of we-space. In the business modeling we-space, not all kinds of diversity will make the difference. You will need people that master systemic thinking and transformational thinking and operate from a self-aware script. Yeah. So the type of diversity that dominates it is essential to understand.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the meantime, I submitted a very instant poll about the quality of this talk. So if you can provide your feedback. Just for your information, Jan, the first feedback are very positive.
Well, I see that here on the screen. Are there in the meantime any questions? Or things that came to your mind while listening to the introduction I gave?
Yeah, just a comment from me. I think that the opportunity to record this session is really valuable because we can re-listen and re-go into the presentation. So I think it's really valuable. So
I will publish the presentation tomorrow on my LinkedIn page. So you will be able to download the presentation if you wish to do so. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So if there are no more questions, okay. Thank you, Jan, for sharing this, full of insights, really, really valuable for me.
It was my pleasure. If you have any questions popping up after this session or while reading or re-listening to the recording, don't hesitate to mail me. I'm very happy to provide you for a response.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jan.
And thank
Thanks.
you, Corrado, for inviting me.
No, it was a great pleasure for me.
Okay.
See you again in February. Okay, keep in touch in the meantime. But again, just a reminder
I will be back in February, and in February I will focus more on those thought structures and the maturity phases, and how that helps in thinking digitally. The question will be, what is a digital mindset, in fact, and can we develop a digital mindset? So it will bring me much closer to how can I start working with thought structures and with the maturity of people.
Yeah, very probably we will be able to publish the video of this event before that one.
Well, I hope so.
Ciao, ciao.
No, for sure this will going to happen.
Okay.
Okay, thank you again.
Thanks,
you for
yeah.
joining.
Good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the
Thank
rest
you.
of the evening.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Dex, also. Corrado.